Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Wandavision. So, ultimately, within this episode, I'm here to ultimately talk about this. Reasonably, I think this episode, I liked this episode just because reasonably we're actually going to forcibly have to give you answers because this is close to the very last episode. So, we have it to where in this episode we do have or have figured out a villain, which ultimately was basically, in all actuality, from day one, kind of really there all along, but ultimately it just seems like they do the Ghostbusters 2016 approach to having this villain being like, oh hey, this villain was here all along kind of thing, and ha ha ha, and here's how exactly this is all broken down and whatever, what have you. And I'm like, yeah, they're basically doing the Ghostbusters 2016 villain showcase basically for this one, which is just god awful, but it is what it is. They just need something to just really showcase in this episode besides just Wanda ultimately just kind of going through and just kind of playing the usual like kind of character for this themed episode. So we end up having it to where I immediately, once the intro kicked in, I'm like, oh, okay, so this is going to be exactly like so and so themed show. And I was like, okay, this is going to be fun. But when looking at it, I was also just like, I think the whole portions of which where people would go on, like basically off to the side onto their own to go and do the thing that they do in this episode, I think is like, God, that's just another way of eating time. Everything to me, everything that is put onto this show is just like, man, how could we just kind of stretch things? And like, I was just like, even in the seventh episode, they're still trying to figure out how to just stretch things, and this is the way to do it. So yeah, there was some interesting Marvel stuff that ultimately finally popped in here. Stuff that a lot of people probably had to Google and stuff like that. Even to me, I had been familiar with some of these names, with the exclusion of the villain of this episode, because I don't know enough about Scarlet Witch and Vision. But anyways, so I just immediately was won over by this episode just because I'm like, oh, okay, great, this show is almost over kind of thing. And they have to finally give us something. That's something ultimately not being the greatest thing to place in here, or put in here, or whatever, but it's good enough, I guess. Excuse me, I had to check something. But anyways, so reasonably, I guess there's more stuff to talk about in this episode to really talk about in a very cryptic sense. Because reasonably, at this point, this show is almost over. So, hawa, huzzah, hezay, woohoo, the show's almost over. And we can actually get to the real answers, which is, again, all done on the last episode. Because reasonably, if they're going to go into a whole battling out versus hero, villain, and that's going to be the last episode, I am just going to be just like, really? Like, I am going to be, like, I think I'm just so fed up with this show. I'm so just really to the point where this last episode has to, like, make up for all of the crap that has been going on through this entire season. And I hope that that last episode is going to be like, wow, man, like, I hated this entire season, but that last episode, though, is what I'm hoping is what's going to happen. Because when looking at it, we are just milking every little thing out, and it's getting ridiculous. So, speaking of milking out, speaking of let's get on with the show, let's ultimately go into that spoiler time and crank this bad boy out. So without a doubt, if ultimately you don't know much about Marvel at the end of the day, come into spoilers, and ultimately you'll be in the know about some of the Marvel stuff that happened in this episode that some people might not be aware of. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this show. So we have it to where Scarlet Witch is ultimately sulking around within this episode. She is just kind of like, man, I'm so sad kind of thing. Because ultimately it seems like there's a lot of characters that end up being either sad or depressed or whatever through more current TV. It's showing reality most of the time. That ultimately someone could actually be really sad or depressed or whatever. It seems that ultimately Scarlet ultimately is seemingly having even less control of this world than she was before. It seems that ultimately Scarlet is consistently going through her house and things are consistently changing. So here's the thing. So ultimately the commercial ultimately talks about a thing called Nexus. Nexus actually is a actual Marvel thing. So we end up having it to ultimately I had played Marvel Strike Force, and it has in one of the places it has Nexus. And so immediately I'm like, okay, I'm already familiar with that word. So immediately I actually looked up the definition of that word. And so Nexus actually is a reality where anything is kind of possible. Where basically, like, for example, we have it to where we have a Deadpool book called Deadpool versus Deadpool kills the Marvel Universe, let's just say. So that is like one reality that ultimately is part of Marvel, but it's not the main canon kind of thing. That's not within the main story, because ultimately if Deadpool killed the entire Marvel Universe, then the Marvel Universe wouldn't exist anymore and they wouldn't be doing comic books. So ultimately that's a place where everything can ultimately exist at one point in time. It's a bending of reality where anything could be possible, but when looking at it, so recently you have it to where it's basically a story where all things are possible in one location. That is just basically kind of what Nexus really is. That is kind of what the bubble is for Scarlet Witch. She had created a nexus for herself. So the bubble, the thing that I call the bubble, which now is a red bubble, I guess it's a bubblegum bubble now. So that is the nexus where all realities can possibly happen. So going into here, so we also have Agatha Harkness, which ultimately is an actual villain of, I guess, Scarlet Witch and Vision. I'm not deep diving really into comic books that much lately, so I didn't know who this was. And when after looking at it, I'm like, it's an old lady with a cat. So honestly, they just kind of just put a villain in here, which is probably the lamest villain to put in here. It's an old lady with a cat kind of thing. Just to be like, nah, here's a villain, there we go. And I'm like, this is garbage. So, the introduction of this episode, or the intro of this episode, is really a Office kind of approach. If you guys remember the Steve Carell show The Office, or the other show The Office, reasonably that is what this episode is. It's just a runoff of The Office. So we end up having it to where I guess we have Vision eventually going off and going and finding Darcy within this episode, and we have it to where there's circus performers that are by her, because ultimately she is supposed to be some escape artist at some point. Here's the interesting thing that I got from this episode. I'm like, well, are these people the people from, like, Circus of Crime? Like, are they actually in this episode and we don't even realize it? Is that the Circus of Crime is actually in here? Like, I was kind of expecting there to be some kind of stalling factor to get Vision back to Wanda, and I thought maybe the Circus of Crime would have been an interesting way to stall Vision from getting to Wanda, and I thought that that would have been actually exciting to actually have a real actual fight out in any part of this show. There has been no fisticuffs flying, there's been no fight scenes, there's been nothing going on. And I was like thinking, please let there just be Circus of Crime right now so Vision can fight these guys. So ultimately just showcasing finally that there is an actual fight scene going on in the show, because there has been yet one freaking fight in this entire thing. And if we even do have a fight that goes on in the last episode, it'll just be a magical fight. So we can't even do that either. What garbage is that? So, moving on. So, we end up having it. So, Vision is to go back with Darcy to ultimately go on into trying to make it to Wanda. And so the entire time we end up having it to where Scarlet Witch is consistently going off into a solo room to ultimately narrate portions of her life that is going on. We end up having Agnes coming in and ultimately going and consistently mentioning that she has something on her back, and ultimately she wants everyone to check it out, like it's some like wart or something like that. And I'm like, wow, this is exciting television. We ultimately have it to where Wanda is just consistently moaning and groaning about something that makes no sense to me. All while that is going on, we end up having it to where Wiccan and Speed are ultimately mentioning to their mother, it's like, yeah, like things are really getting out of control in this city. We end up having it to where Wanda is going through her home and getting cereal, and all of a sudden the milk ultimately changes from different kind of time periods. We ultimately have it to where Wanda ends up getting a bowl of cereal and then ultimately sits next to the TV, and the TV is consistently changing, and the walls are consistently changing, and everything is consistently changing. So basically, we are to eventually have it to where Agnes takes the kids, and then Agnes eventually comes back. We eventually end up finding out that supposedly the kids are down playing in the basement, we are to assume, while Agnes is just taking care of Agnes stuff. So we end up having it to where Scarlet Witch ends up going down into the basement to seemingly have this basement seeming like a never-ending thing. To where eventually we have it to where Agnes eventually reveals to herself that she is Agatha Harkness. And I'm like, okay, so anybody who would be any person of comic book knowledge would probably be saying, who is this? Like, this is not a name. Like, this is not a named villain. This is just some old lady with a cat, and we're supposed to be excited about this? Like, this is the big reveal? Like, it couldn't have been some exciting character that ultimately everybody fully fledgedly has heard about? No, it's just some Agatha character, which we're supposed to be all excited about. Like, and basically, we have it to where it's this whole entire scene where it says, yeah, it was Agatha the whole entire time. It was Agatha. And I'm like, any of the stuff that she did, any of the villainous stuff that she did, was nothing that I could shake a stick at or care about. Of like, oh man, she really, like, Agatha really killed somebody in these episodes. Man, did Agatha just kill all these people in these episodes. What a villainous character that she put on and did, and oh my god, wow, what a just amazing thing that Agatha came in here and was just slaying and filleting everyone. Wow. I am so just utterly shocked that Agatha's here to just save the day. Who cares? So, yeah. that is really all that happened within this episode. We end up having it to where I think the funniest part is when Vision was ultimately going and talking on the side of the road with his God, what was it, RV or something that ultimately him and Dorothy went through. It was kind of funny when eventually Vision realizes, like, God, why am I even narrating right now? Why am I even talking right now? And we end up having it to where Vision, like, takes off his mic and then flies off to go and speak to Scarlet. So, also, what is going on recently within this episode is we eventually have it to where, stubbornly, the sword people are thinking that they can just send some high-tech Humvee into the WandaVision bubble, and everything will be like they'll be able to just send some spaceship or spacecraft or some outer space Humvee into the WandaVision bubble, and everything will be fine, which ultimately it won't. So, because immediately when Rambo starts driving the thing into the bubble, I'm like, this isn't gonna work. There's no way. Like, WandaVision is or Wanda. God, why do I keep saying WandaVision? Wanda is too strong for this to just, oh yeah, we're just gonna send a high tech thing and it's going to work. Yeah, you and what army? So, like, because everything has just worked before, so all of a sudden now it's just absurdly going to work, I'm sure. So, we end up having it to where Rambo ends up driving this vehicle, and the vehicle is just kind of stuck in this bubble. And eventually, we have it to where the vehicle eventually pushes back out, and it is now like a half truck, half uh, space truck thing. And so ultimately, we have it to where now Rambo stubbornly, or what I would call her almost Spectra at this point, she ultimately just forces her body through this bubble to mention to everybody, hey guys, I got this kind of thing. And so we end up having her just walking through this bubble because ultimately she has supposedly powers now. So she should be able to just walk through this bubble. So we end up having it to her Spectrum goes through here, and like she all of a sudden is seeing several different variations of herself, and ultimately she goes through this bubble ultimately to have it to where her eyes are different colors. Wow, her eyes are different colors. That's the only effect thing that they could have done for this character. They couldn't showcase any kind of power whatsoever. They just say, oh yeah, her eyes though, isn't that exciting? Her eyes? Wow, that's amazing. That's an amazing effect. Wow, I'm so excited about those eyes of hers. Ooh, wow, that's exciting. So we end up having it to where Rambo ends up going and seeking out Wanda, which, like, I'm like, that's your first mistake. You should have went and gone to Vision because you're stupid, because that should have been a thing that you should have done. So, but ultimately, I guess for Rambo, it was just easily and convenient for her to just find Wanda, because ultimately she knew exactly where she would be every single time, which would be at home. So we end up having it to where Spectrum ends up going and seeking out Wanda, and they end up just having this talk out where ultimately they kind of just have to reflect on the time that they've been here for, because that's really all that they could really have said. We have it to where Spectrum is trying to reason with Wanda, but Agatha is ultimately having her claws into Wanda, which ultimately is making Wanda just push on and to not ultimately talk to Spectrum. We ultimately have it to where Wanda is ultimately showcasing her powers in the middle of in her front yard to everyone, and it seems that ultimately Spectrum isn't using any of her powers, so that's just great that we just wasted time just having a stare down with these two people, and that's about it. So we ultimately have it to where Spectrum is trying to reason with Wanda, but Wanda isn't listening to any of this. Basically, we have it to where Spectrum is telling Wanda that ultimately, like, hey, you can stop all this, you can solve all this, you can whatever. But we have it to where Agnes just takes Wanda back into the home, and we don't have it to where Wanda ultimately shoves Spectrum away, or ultimately does any other kind of things that ultimately blah blah blah. So yeah, so recently we have a cutscene that happened after this episode, which did nothing. We end up having it to where Rambo ends up mentioning, or ends up just going into what would be Wanda's basement, and we have it to where Quicksilver ultimately mutters something that makes no sense, and that is just the whole entire episode in a nutshell. There really is nothing else going on but them just kind of like wasting a lot of time within this episode. So yeah, so Nexus and Agatha were the only real true Google worthy things out of this whole thing, and I'm sure everyone after watching this episode would have to Google all this stuff to figure all this out. Because that's ultimately what I did. Because ultimately I was like, yeah, I know that these names are familiar. Agatha wasn't, but I can ultimately understand why exactly we had it to where this witch ultimately was creating this television world, because she has been through so many years of television that when looking at it, like, she is able to go through here and figure all this out. So, and figure out all the time periods and stuff along those lines, because she has more knowledge about all this stuff than probably Scarlet Witch does. But again, we have it to where, like, Wanda has been staying in this bubble. So it's kind of like, I would say that recently Scarlet Witch was the villain this whole time, but we have Agatha that was kind of pulling the strings. Uh, and I'm assuming that the entire last episode is going to have us really understand how we got to the Westview bubble. I'm assuming Agatha is probably going to have a whole entire backstory in this whole entire last episode to get us to episode one, basically. Is I think what's going to happen. And then probably after that, we're going to have to show somebody from the Marvel Universe, which I'm hoping is going to be Doctor Strange at this point, just kind of getting Wanda out of this whole thing. Because I'm like, dude, we've had 7 episodes and there's been no Strange. There's been no Captain Marvel, which ultimately they keep talking about. I'm waiting for somebody to show up to really just be like, ooh, wow. Like, hey, all these episodes sucked, but we have to have one last, like, huzzah. Because ultimately, we had it to where Benedict Cumberbatch had mentioned that he is going to be on one of these episodes. So it probably has to be the last one at this point now. If only he would have not said that he would have been on this show at all. But because now recently it's like basically like, well, so he's only going to be on the last episode. There's like, if they would have maybe alluded to that Strange was going to be here before here, or maybe Strange would have had some lead up before this to just kind of give us like a, ooh, wow, like, hey, go ahead and watch episode whatever the heck, because Strange is going to be involved. If anything, if he would have actually been involved in this show earlier, like been like dipped into here like via the Halloween episode, I think that would have been better off to help us understand why have a Halloween episode. But yeah, anyways, I'm going to get out of here because yeah, there's not much theory crafting at this point. It's basically just like, well, the last episode is probably going to go through the Agatha story and then giving us a lead up to episode 1. And then after that, we're probably going to just have like, okay, hey, here's going to have to forcibly be a clickbaiting hero that's going to arrive for everyone to just be like, okay, well, great. Now we're going to have it to where things are going to get resolved. And then push on to season 2. this last episode is going to be hilariously probably stretched out to a point of a joking manner. So reasonably, when looking at it, if the last episode is an hour in length, like, I would be happy about that. But when knowing all full well that reasonably, this season hasn't been good. This season hasn't been good. It's been stretchy. It's been milky. It's been anything but good. So that's all that I have to really say about this review, this last episode. So, or the episode before the last episode. So I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.